Howdy, it's Jim Murado, and today we're looking at the Mill Springs Battlefield National Historic Landmark, pretty much in Nancy, Kentucky, and this is their visitor center. And we are about to drive over to the cemetery, and this is actually an interesting battle. Part of me doesn't really know how to describe it. I'm much more of a I get the psychology and the politics of war, but the strategy and that kind of thing, I'm not quite as I don't my mind doesn't grasp it as much as some of the other parts. But I am very fascinated with the Civil War, and this is definitely an interesting moment in this, kind of early on in the Civil War. And if you don't mind, just because there's so much good signage around here, I'm going to mostly be reading signs as we drive and do the battlefield tour. We're doing stops 1 through 8. There's a couple more stops, but they're quite a bit out of the way once you get to the end, once you get to the stop 8. This should take about an hour, and I'm going to try to keep the video rolling the entire time, just so you get a feel of everything. I'm going to start out by reading a little bit from the brochure at the Visitor Center because I think it just gives a quick overview of the battle. On January 19th, 1862, the fields and farms where you are now standing were being rocked by artillery and musket fire as Confederate and Union forces clashed in the Battle of Mill Springs. When the smoke cleared, 150 Confederates and 50 Federal soldiers lay dead on the field, and the Union had its first significant victory of the Civil War. The battle was at first a sensation in the newspapers, both North and South. However, later in the spring of 1862, the horrendous and bloody Battle of Shiloh occurred, and the Battle of Mill Springs was forgotten, overshadowed by the atrocities to come in America's Civil War. Years later, through the actions of young Dorothy Burton, who decorated the Confederate graves on Decoration Day, the battle was again remembered and a monument was placed over the Confederate graves. Once again, however, time dimmed, people's memories in the battle and monuments were forgotten by all but the local people and a few scholars. The battle remained forgotten and the graves unkempt until the 1970s, when efforts were made to preserve the battlefield. Due to lack of funds, these efforts were unsuccessful. However, in 1992, the National Park Service placed Mill Springs Battlefield on the 25 most endangered battlefields list. In June of that year, the Mill Springs Battlefield Association was formed with the purpose of preserving and interpreting the original battlefield. In 1993, Mill Springs Battlefield was designated a National Historic Landmark. In 1997, the Zollicoffer Monument and the Confederate Mass Grave Monument were added to the National Register of Historic Places. Your visit is appreciated, and we hope you enjoy the driving tour. What you'll see on this tour is the result of a strong effort to preserve this battlefield and to educate future generations about the park portion of our nation's history and the part of it that belongs to Kentucky. Again, that's from the front of the little travel map they give you at the Visitor Center. Also from the Mill Springs Battlefield Driving Tour Guide concerning the National Cemetery. Mill Springs National Cemetery officially opened in 1867. The cemetery encompasses approximately 7 acres, one of the smallest active national cemeteries in the country, and holds the graves of many of the Union soldiers killed in the Battle of Mill Springs and other soldiers from the time of the Civil War through today. In the southwest corner of the cemetery is the grave of William and Nancy Logan. The Logans owned most of the land where the battle occurred, and they donated the land for Mill Springs Cemetery. One particularly notable person resting in the cemetery is Sergeant Brent Woods, an African-American Congressional Medal of Honor winner for his service in the Indian Wars. Wood's grave is located beside the flagpole near the center of the cemetery. Standing at a rock wall, the original cemetery wall built in 1867, and looking south across Kentucky 80, one can view the battle area from the federal vantage point. In the orchard directly across the road was the camp of the 1st Ohio Artillery, with the camp of the 10th Indiana located a few hundred yards to the front. The dirt road next to the brick church and passing through the orchard generally follows the course of the old road used by many of the federal troops to reach the front lines. And again, this is stop number 1 on the driving tour, and it's just a Again, a very nice little cemetery here. They were doing some work, so we couldn't quite circle around all of it. From interpretive markers in the cemetery, early in 1866, Captain E.B. Whitman began gathering information in preparation for the reinternment of Union soldiers buried in the Military Division of Tennessee. This huge district included Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Tennessee. Captain Whitman, later Lieutenant Colonel, placed newspaper notices seeking the locations of Union graves. Citizens, chaplains, soldiers, and officers replied. Whitman made 3 major expeditions across the region, stopping at hundreds of battlefields and engagement sites. Because of his tireless work, thousands of Union dead were moved to 12 new national cemeteries. In May 1869, Whitman submitted a detailed summary of this difficult project to the Quartermaster General. The report contains sketches and site plans of each cemetery and data on internments and service affiliation. Prior to 1869, 10 federally established or public cemeteries in Kentucky contained the remains of Union soldiers. The work of reinterring the dead was almost complete when the Army changed its plan and reduced the number of cemeteries to 6. Captain Whitman chose the site for Mill Springs National Cemetery from lands at Logan's Crossroads, owned by William H. Logan. Remains were recovered from temporary graves on the Mill Springs battlefield and other locations within a 40-mile radius. By 1869, a limestone wall enclosed the 3-acre cemetery. Of the 708 original internments, approximately half were unknown. By law, the Secretary of War appointed emeritus and trustworthy superintendent to manage the cemetery. James Burke, a sergeant in Company K, Veterans Reserve Corps, served as the first superintendent here in 1867. He lived on the grounds in a lodge that burned down in 1916. And we are now driving towards stop 2 on the driving tour. And again, I'm going to let the camera go just so you get a sense of this whole tour. I'm going to try to keep the entire tour recorded on here just for your reference in case you ever need it. But yeah, we are going towards stop number 2, the Confederate Cemetery. And since there's a lot going on at that stop, I'm going to go ahead and just read a little bit more from the Mill Springs Battlefield Driving Tour Guide about the stop 2. This stop features a number of interesting items, including the monument to Confederate General Felix K. Zollicoffer and his men and the Confederate mass grave and marker. Both of these were placed here in 1910 by Confederate veterans. Also at this stop are Confederate soldiers' memorial stones, as well as the earth print of the large white oak tree where it was said General Zollicoffer's body was placed after his death during the battle. The white oak tree was known as the Zolli tree and was decorated faithfully each Memorial Day beginning in the early 1900s by a little girl named Dorothy Burton Hudson, whose family has carried on that tradition through 3 generations. In a tragic twist of fate, the tree was struck by lightning in the spring of 1995 and destroyed, leaving only the stump. However, a seedling salvaged from the white oak is planted in the park, and the remains of the old tree are now being crafted into commemorative souvenirs. In 1997, after over a decade of painstaking research for a complete list of Confederate soldiers who died during the Battle of Mill Springs, 148 headstones with the names of each soldier were placed in the area just to the right of the Confederate mass grave. The latest addition to this tour stop is the memorial flame located across the road from Zollicoffer Confederate Cemetery. This monument of stone and flame was built in 1998 and dedicated at the Mill Spring Battlefield annual ceremony, January 17, 1998. The flame is lit for special occasions and memorial dates. This cemetery and the surrounding area was the scene of the heaviest fighting during the battle. The Confederates attacked up the road from the southeast and out of the deep wooded ravine behind the east of the cemetery. The Federals made their main stand along a fence rail just north of the cemetery. And that monument to Zollicoffer that's right in front of us, right there, reads, "On this spot fell General Felix K. Zollicoffer of Tennessee, January 19th, 1862. Lieutenants Bailey Peyton Jr., H.M.R. Fogg, and more than 150 of their Confederate associates in the Battle of Fishing Creek here died with General Zollicoffer for right as they saw it. They are part of the great host who crowned Southern manhood with glorious immortality. They gave their lives, the noblest of all offerings, at duty's call, and fame will ever point with pride to the sacred place where these heroes now so peacefully sleep." From another interpretive sign here at this spot, "Mistaken identity. About 7 o'clock the morning of January 19th, 1862, Confederate General Felix Zollicoffer rode across the road to your left. Near here, in the dim light and fog, he saw a mounted officer, Union Colonel Speed Fry. Both men mistakenly assumed the other was a fellow officer. Fry later described the event. So thoroughly was I convinced that he was one of our men, I did not hesitate to ride up to his side, so closely that our knees touched. He said to me, we must not shoot our own men, to which I responded, of course not. I would not do so intentionally. Pointing, he said, those are our men." As Fry moved away, Confederate Major Henry Fogg rode into view and shouted, "General, they are the enemy." He then fired at Fry, but the shot missed. Fry fired at Zollicoffer, as several nearby Union soldiers also fired. Zollicoffer and Fogg died in the exchange. Zollicoffer's men later placed his body under a large white oak that stood between here and the stone wall. After the battle, Union General George Thomas ordered Zollicoffer's body returned to Nashville. In 1910, the United Confederate Veterans erected the monument here in his honor. And there's one more marker that I wanted to read concerning the Zoli tree. After Confederate General Felix Zollicoffer was fatally wounded at the Battle of Mill Springs on January 19, 1862, his men placed his body under a white oak tree. In the years that followed, the tree became known as the Zoli tree. 40 years passed with no effort made to remember or honor Zollicoffer or the Confederate soldiers who lay in the mass grave nearby. In 1902, 10-year-old Dorothy Burton witnessed the lavish ceremonies held on Memorial Day for Union soldiers buried in Mill Springs National Cemetery. She realized that the Confederate soldiers buried nearby all but been forgotten. That year, Dorothy decorated the Zoli tree with a flower entwined evergreen wreath and placed the flowers on the mass grave. She continued decorating the Zoli tree on Memorial Day until 1947, when disabled by arthritis. Her family continues the tradition. And then there's also a note on that same marker. On June 9th, 1995, a severe storm destroyed the original Zoli tree. Arborists judged the tree, then almost 90 feet tall and 15 feet in circumference, to be between 200 and 250 years old. This young white oak, planted by the Mill Springs Battlefield Association on Memorial Day, 1996, as a seedling of the original tree. And just for what it's worth, I kind of walked out into the field. There's actually a walking trail through here, and there was a nice fella doing some weed eating and mowing. And when he saw me come through, he actually stopped. I didn't notice him. I don't think he noticed me at first, but he very politely stopped mowing, and I told him not to do that, or not, he didn't have to worry about me being out there. His mowing wasn't going to bother me, but he still stopped mowing, and I thought that was very pleasant. And there's actually a walking trail through here, and there's several more plaques just in this area about the battle. And actually, just a whole lot of the battle happened here. I think this was really the heart of everything. Where the famous tree is and where the Confederate, mass gravesite is. This is really where everything happened. And one of the other markers reads, It was mid-morning, and the battle was raging when directly across the road, Union Colonel Robert McCook ordered the 9th Ohio Infantry to charge the enemy. It was one of the few successful bayonet charges of the Civil War and was instrumental in bringing the Battle of Mill Springs to a close. The 9th Ohio was a German-American regiment and the only Union regiment present with battle experience. Major Gustav Kamerling urged his men forward, saying, "If it gets too hot for you, shut your eyes, my boys. Forward." The bayonet charge flanked the Confederate left and turned toward the high hill in the distance. The sustained charge of more than a mile created panic among the Confederates. Some Tennessee troops, who feared they would be outflanked and trapped, fled. It was the beginning of a full-scale Confederate retreat. And of course, right now I'm just kind of walking back over to the main monument there, kind of telling about the battle and looking over this ways towards the mass grave where the Confederates were actually buried. And then to the right of it, we'll look at them more later, are the headstones that have been placed there, long since the battle was over, marking at least, the known Confederates that are buried there. This is a really nice park too, by the way. There's some picnic tables, as you noticed, and a little gazebo. And my wife and I took a little picnic lunch out here, and it was just a really nice place to spend a little bit of time before we made our way on with the rest of the tour. And again, we came from the visitor center and the museum. I'll add a little bit of video from the museum at the end of this, just so you can get an idea of the visitor center and what's there. It's $5 a person, I think, adult. There's other discounts for kids and groups. I'm sure there's a discount for military. But it's $5 a person to tour the museum, and it's a really nice museum. They have a lot of relics from the battle there, a lot of information, some life-size dioramas, and that kind of thing. And they also show a 15-minute video about the battle. I do always love watching the videos when we go to, especially Civil War sites. The thing is, though, here we are in 2020, and well, people are thicker than they were in the 1860s. Most of the guys fighting in the Civil War would have been considered just skin and bones by our standards. You watch those recreation and reenactment videos, and they're a little, well, they're modernly made. Also, I always watch and I notice how clean the uniforms are. I wish those actors would go roll around in the dirt a little bit before they made those. They look too spiffy for what that's worth. But yeah, this is a really nice little park, and this is these headstones are laid out very attractively. And it's just a nice little place to have a picnic and think about that battle, which was a very significant Union victory at that time in the war that that the Union needed for what that's worth, but also that the South felt. Wanted to specifically get a little shot of Zollicoffer's stone there. And again, there's a couple of other monuments here. There's several signs put up by the park, kind of telling you what happened at the battle here. But yeah, we are leaving the Zollicoffer Confederate Cemetery Park here and getting down to stop number 3 on the tour. So now we're going towards stop number 3, and this is just us pulling out of the park. For the sake of time, I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about tour stop number 3 that we're about to go to. Again, this is from the Mill Springs Battlefield Driving Tour Guide that they give you for free at the museum. This hilltop was the area where the 17th, 28th, and 29th Tennessee and the 16th Alabama Infantry regiments attempted to hold back the advancing Federal Army in a last stand to allow the other retreating Confederate units to escape destruction. This vantage point allows a good view of the field from the Confederate side, including the ravine east of the road, used by the 15th Mississippi and 20th Tennessee regiments to attack the Federal line. Rutledge's Confederate artillery was stationed across the road on the forward slope of the hill. These guns were only able to fire a few shots because of the wooded terrain and fear of hitting their own men. Buried in Fairview Cemetery is Dorothy Burton Hudson, who began the tradition of decorating the Zoli tree in the Confederate mass grave. This just shows you a little bit about... I wish I would have read that as we were taking the tour. I did not read that, so I didn't go over myself to visit Dorothy's grave. I would have if I would have recognized that, if that would have hit me. So I've got to go back there again at some point to check that out. And trust me, I will. This was actually our second visit doing this battlefield tour. We did it 2 or 3 years ago. So yeah, we pulled in here. There was another couple checking things out too. There was a guy taking photos nearby, and he warned me to watch out for ticks, which was a very good warning. I am a tick magnet. And from one of the interpretive markers at this point, the Confederates west of the road fled in disarray after the 9th Ohio Infantry executed a successful bayonet charge. The pursuing Federals turned the tide on the east side of the road, and the entire Confederate line broke. The 16th Alabama Infantry stood firm against the surging Federals here on Last Stand Hill. Their determined resistance allowed the beaten Confederate army to escape. The 16th Alabama, commanded by Colonel William B. Wood, a Methodist minister, had held their ground south of the battle all morning. Wood watched the action unfold while his regiment, one of only 2 armed with modern weapons, stood in reserve. Bullets whizzed around the men, numbed by the cold, wet weather. The constant smoke and the noise of battle kept them on edge as they waited for 2 hours for orders. As the Confederate line fell apart, General William Carroll ordered the 16th Alabama to move forward. Wood moved the regiment to the crest of the hill and saw the Union line marching toward him. Confederate soldiers rushed to the rear, knowing that all that stood between them and disaster was Colonel Wood's 330 men. Wood ordered the men to stand their position and meet the enemy, drive him back or die in their tracks. Rallying several companies of the 29th Tennessee, Wood made a stand. The regiment fired a volley, retreated a short distance behind a rail fence, and fired again. How long they held is unclear, but this small detachment stalled the Union pursuit. They created a gap that allowed the bulk of the Confederate army to escape capture. So yeah, there was some pretty exciting action going on there, and we are now driving to the fourth stop on the tour. So we're heading out of the little parking area here at the third stop, Last Stand Hill, and there was a big gouge kind of in the driveway area as you came up in there. So if you're taking this tour, watch out for that. But yeah, we are now going towards tour stop number 4, Confederate Field Hospital. According to the map, it's about 1/4 of a mile south. So we're not going to drive very far, but according to the Mill Springs Battlefield Driving Tour Guide, during the battle, a small log cabin located here served as the main Confederate field hospital. A few of the foundation stones are still visible. The hospital was in operation throughout the battle until its capture by Federal forces after the Confederate retreat from the battlefield. And this is true. Actually, we're going to pull in here. You're basically in a home's backyard, but there's a little parking area, and there are some huge stones that you can tell were the foundation of a cabin of some sort. And just for what it's worth, if you're not a Civil War person, when they talk about a hospital, a field hospital during the battle, they're not talking about, let me take your blood pressure and give you an aspirin. Pretty much they're talking about sawing limbs off. Literally, that's a pretty big part of what they were doing. I'm not sure how much of that occurred here. That's when you get into Gettysburg and some of the bigger battles, a field hospital, they were pretty primitive at that time. So just keep that in mind when you're researching the Civil War. And as we pull into this stop, you can see there right in the center of the screen going off onto the right, there is an interpretive sign put there by the park to tell you about the field hospital. And you could definitely see the foundation rocks back behind that sign. but I'll read that sign to you. Soon after the first shots of the battle were exchanged at Timmy's Branch, Confederate surgeons set up a field hospital and a small log house that stood here. Some of the wounded found their own way here. Friends carried others. One of the last soldiers brought here was Charlie Clemenson of the 19th Tennessee. He was left at the hospital by 3 friends as the defeated Confederate army retreated. Years later, W.J. Wisham recalled that day. Pink Henderson, Clay Perry, and the writer carried Charlie from the field in a blanket. Poor Charlie was dying when we laid him down. We can never forget the sad and anxious expression on his face as we left him in his last sad trial of life, dying alone, deserted by all whom he thought were his friends, left on the cold ground with naught but the cold rain to wash his brow. Buried in unmarked graves, Union troops captured the hospital, and the wounded and 3 surgeons who were unwilling to desert the men in their care. Charlie Clemenson and several others later died here. Federal soldiers buried the dead in unmarked graves in a small family cemetery near the house. The bloodstains on the floor were still visible when the house was razed in 1940. Just for what it's worth, as I read these signs that you see at the battlefield, there are, and I wish I would have videotaped, I didn't even think about it, but there are some great illustrations, obviously no photographs, but there are some great illustrations showing what they're talking about. So even though there's no home there now on that site, you still get a picture of what that was like. And again, this field hospital is basically in the back of these nice folks' yard. Yeah, I hope when you visit you're always thoughtful of the people that live nearby. And we are next heading to tour stop number 5, Timmy's Branch. According to the Mill Springs Battlefield Driving Tour Guide, that's about 3/4 of a mile down the road a little further. Again, just driving in the same direction. There's a little map on the free guide they give you at the museum telling you where to go. On the driving tour guide, it just says, in the pre-dawn of January 19th, 1862, the Confederate forces collided with the Federal pickets near this small creek. This area is the site of the first shots fired in the Battle of Mill Springs. Now, I'll go ahead and read the marker at stop number 5 just so you've got an idea of what's going on once we get there. Union General George H. Thomas placed cavalry here at Timmy's Branch on the road between his army and the Confederates. These men acted as an early warning system in case of a surprise attack. It was here that the first shots of the Battle of Mill Springs were fired. The Confederates advance. In the first hours of January 19, 1862, the Confederate Army began the 8-mile trek from Beech Grove to present-day Nancy. It was very dark and cold. Clouds and heavy rain obscured the light of the moon. Men and horses floundered in the mud, and progress was painfully slow. Sergeant George C. Thrasher, 1st Kentucky Cavalry, U.S., commanded the 20 men posted here. Around 6 o'clock, well before daylight, Confederate cavalry approached. The Union challenge, "Halt, who goes there?" was answered with a pistol shot. The Federal soldiers opened fire. The Battle of Mill Springs had begun. Thrasher's men dashed to their horses and galloped north. They stopped at a small log house on a low rise west of the road, where Thrasher sent word that the Confederate infantry was moving in force. And then it mentions on the same sign the old Mill Springs Road. In front of you is the original Mill Springs Road. Feel free to walk it to the creek where the old crossing is visible. As you return to this point, you will see the old roadbed stretched to the south. And just for what it's worth, as I mentioned earlier about ticks, this is a heavily wooded area, and I was not going to do any exploring out in those woods today. My wife was with me. Maybe if she wasn't with me, I might have, because she gets pretty upset with me when I go running around in the woods like that. ever since I was a little kid running around in rural western Kentucky, I just attract ticks. And that's a story for another day. But this is something, maybe in the fall I might try to come back and explore some of these areas a little more thoroughly, because they're pretty open, and they're, unlike some spots you might visit, kind of welcome to just kind of explore around a bit, and that's kind of cool. And there's some cane. I don't know if you saw it when we pulled in. There's some cane in this area too. But yeah, the little creek area and stuff that was mentioned is just a little bit too far out of the way for me to explore around on this particular day. But again, that'll be something for another day. Maybe a guy's trip one day soon. And also, you'll probably notice as we're going along, this trip is almost like in reverse order. You're kind of going backwards in the battle in a way, which is interesting. Just something to think about as you're making the trip. Our next stop, yeah, there's that cane I was talking about, and there's the marker I just read from a moment ago. But yeah, look at that cane. Our next stop is going to be tour stop number 6, Molden's Hill, and this is actually the largest gap that you're going to notice as we drive. There's about a 4-mile gap between stop 5 and 6. So I wanted to mention a couple of other historic markers, not roadside historic markers, but just interpretive signs put up by the park that I thought was pretty interesting, especially back up going towards the Confederate cemetery. So yeah, since we've got a little bit of time between stop 5 and 6, I just again wanted to mention a couple of other things. And this is again from another marker up closer to the main heart of the battle. And I just thought this was interesting about preserving knowledge and witnesses to the battle. Alfred Edward Matthews, a renowned illustrator, created this drawing. We don't know if he participated in the battle, but it is obvious he was here. You are standing approximately where Matthews stood to sketch this scene. Compare the image to the landscape. It is still remarkably accurate. During the Civil War, newspapers and weekly magazines relied on artists to supply drawings of battles. Photography was in its infancy. Subjects had to stand still, often for several minutes, while the image was exposed. This technical limitation made photographing battles impossible. The most accurate battle scenes were drawn by artists who observed the battle or visited the battlefield shortly afterward. Alfred E. Matthews was born in England in 1831. 2 years later, his family immigrated to Ohio. When the Civil War began, Matthews joined the 1st Ohio Light Artillery, later transferring to the 31st Ohio Infantry. While a soldier, Matthews drew more than 30 sketches of scenes he witnessed, or from first-hand accounts. After the war, 3 firms hired Matthews to make sketches of his drawings suitable for production as lithographs. Matthews settled in Colorado in 1866. He died there in 1874. And along with the sketch that Matthews did, there's a little note on the sign that I was reading from talking about how in the 90s, when they tried to restore the battlefield, they used his sketches to try to restore the battlefield back to its 1862 appearance because it was very overgrown. And from another sign up towards the front part of the battlefield again, I thought this was interesting. Here's a little biographical information on Virginian George H. Thomas. Thomas commanded the Union Army at the Battle of Mill Springs. Because he was from a prominent slaveholding family, many, including President Abraham Lincoln, initially questioned his loyalty. His meritorious service here dispelled those doubts. George Henry Thomas graduated from West Point in 1840 at the age of 24 and served in the U.S. Army until his death in 1870. When the Civil War began, he made the fateful decision to remain loyal to the Union. Thomas later said, "Turn it every way I could. The one thing that was uppermost was duty to the government of the United States." His sister never spoke to him again. So I think, again, if you're watching this, you're interested in the Civil War, you know how complicated these situations could be. You had guys, fighting for the North who were slaveholding, and you had guys fighting for the South who were, not for slavery. It's kind of a crazy thing, and you read a lot about that whole loyalty thing. Lee, for example, was very conflicted about what to do, but he stuck with his state loyalty over his national loyalty, whereas Thomas went the other way. So again, we're heading towards tour stop number 6, Moulden's Hill. Just to read you a little bit about that again from the driving tour guide given out at the museum. The Federal forces pursuing the beaten Confederates halted here the night of January 19th, 1862, to rest and prepare for an assault on the Confederate fortifications in the morning. The Federals deployed artillery on the high ground around this area and shelled the Confederate works all night. When the Federals made their attack on the morning of January 20th, they found the Confederates had retreated across the river during the night. Not to get too far ahead of myself, because we haven't got to that stop yet, but I'll go ahead and read the interpretive sign that's at Moulden's Hill. The evening of January 19th, 1862, Union forces pursuing the beaten Confederates halted at a small log school nearby. The Confederates had used the school as a headquarters for their pickets before the battle. Union soldiers rested here as they prepared to assault the Confederate earthworks in the morning. Federal artillery deployed on Moulden's Hill, the high ground to your left. The cannon fired throughout the night, discharging over 300 rounds into the fortified Confederate camp at Beech Grove and the steamboat Noble Ellis, which was ferrying the Confederates across the Cumberland River. When the Federals assaulted the earthworks at Beech Grove, the next morning they found them deserted. The Confederate army had escaped across the river. Later, Union Colonel Speed Fry asked General Thomas, "General, why didn't you send in a demand for surrender last night?" Thomas replied, "Hang in, Fry, I never once thought of it." Alright, so forgive me for covering our next stop before we even get to it, but like I said, there's a little bit of distance there, and this was a nice drive through the country, and nice little rural roads here. I enjoy that a lot. And we just had a nice little drive here. Well, but let me take a moment to tell you too that we did not hit the last 2 stops on this driving trail, which I think a lot of people skip anyway. I know the first time we did this trail, we didn't get to do basically the stop number 9 and stop number 10, because you get down here to the little ferry area, the ferry landing site, which is stop number 8, and the next 2 sites, stop number 9 and stop number 10, are across Lake Cumberland. But there's no way to get there unless you turn around. You basically have to drive a pretty good ways to get back to that area, because there's not a bridge or anything to get you there. One of the houses, the Brown Lanier House, is open for tours, but we asked at the museum and they told us that it's currently not open for tours. So we figured that would be something for another day. We figured we would come back when that house is open for tours, and we would make a point to try to do the tour and try to hit the 2 houses we missed. Lots of pretty barns through here. I love seeing barns as I'm driving. But yeah, there's basically two houses that served as headquarters different times during the battle. Looks like there's a grist mill. So that's definitely something to check out for another day, and it's associated with the battle. Something I definitely need to hit, but again, I want to come back when they're offering tours and that sort of thing. And this is a really nice area. A couple things about this area. Less than a mile from the visitor center where we started, there's a produce store. I believe it's called Haney's Produce, and it's just a super nice stop in this area. Stop there before you go on your tour, get some coffee. I think if you watched my video about Amish Country, Ohio, I love fried apple pies. And man, I think they were $3.50 each, but they were stuffed. They were huge, and I felt totally guilty about eating it afterwards, but it was a really good fried pie. We found some peaches. Been enjoying peaches this year. And that's just a really nice place. They've got obviously some nice little pastry type items. They had cookies, I noticed. Yeah, so that place is it's just nice. They have like a little kind of shop in the front, and then they have some of their produce and stuff in the back. And we like that place a lot. Also, this isn't that far. It's not horribly far from Somerset. And as we drove down this particular morning, we knew the visitor center opened at 10, and we like to get a good early start every morning. So we swung through Somerset, and we got coffee at Baxter's Coffee. That's just a nice local chain that's only in Somerset. I think they've got several locations now, including like their little roastery, and they just have good coffee. I like what they're doing. It's local. It's a good place to support, and I think Somerset realizes how lucky they are to have Baxter. So I stopped there. I can't remember what kind of coffee I got. It was a Hawaiian. It was some sort of Hawaiian banana something flavored decaf of the day, and man, was it good. I'm trying to go easy on my coffee. I'm trying to drink coffee like it's a treat these days, and that really was something special getting that this particular morning. I picked up a t-shirt there while I was there too, just because I really, really like what they're doing. So yeah, Somerset's not too far from here. It's kind of the biggest town nearby. So yeah, we actually swung through Somerset on the way down and on the way back, and we stopped in Berea on our way home because we love Berea. Lots of good history in these areas. I've mentioned before, I'm a Berea grad. I met my wife while working at Berea. We met while working at Boone Tavern, and Berea has a whole lot of the Berea Richmond area, especially has a lot of Civil War history. And I'm really proud to say that I went to Berea and that I met my wife there. And we get there at least once or twice a month. Yeah, and as I mentioned before too about the ticks, we had gone to Perryville, the Perryville battlefield, a couple of weeks before we were here in Mill Springs. And we kind of did the driving tour with everything going on the way it is right now. We didn't want to get out of the car too much, but I still got out of the car to take some pictures and to make notes about the historic markers and and to read what the signs had to say. And in Perryville, and they actually warned us. We called them to see what was going on in Perryville, and they had warned us that the ticks were plentiful right now, and they sure are. This has been a bad summer for ticks. I've seen quite a few of them here lately. In Perryville, I made a video of Perryville. I'll probably try to get it up soon. Talked to one of the volunteers there, and he actually does guided tours of the battlefield. And I think whatever group you've got up to 4 people, I think they do like an ATV kind of thing, and I think it's like $20 an hour to have like a little private tour of the battlefield. I'm gonna have to do that for one reason, because that's a crazy bargain. That is really cheap, and that just sounds like a lot of fun. So more on Perryville later. More on Richmond later too. They've got that great museum and just a lot going on in Richmond. We visited there. I need to visit there again. And so yeah, we're at Molden's Hill that I mentioned earlier. So we just stop here very briefly before getting on to the next stop. I'm going to apologize for that little glare reflection going on in my windshield when it gets sunny. You see my dashboard a little bit. I'm sorry about that. So yeah, we are now about to drive away and drive towards Tour Stop 7, the Confederate fortified camp at Beech Grove. From the Mill Springs Battlefield Driving Tour Guide. This area was the site of the Zollicoffer headquarters at the Beech Grove encampment. The Confederate camp covered all of the area, a narrow neck of land between the Cumberland River and White Oak Creek. The Southern soldiers had built comfortable cabins for their stay in Beech Grove. The camp was protected by a formidable line of earthworks. The earthworks protected the camp followed a slight rise perpendicular to the road about 20 yards north of here. After the camp was abandoned by the Confederates, the Federal forces burned the cabins. Just for what it's worth, I'll read a little bit from the interpretive signs there. In December 1861, less than a month after the Confederate army arrived in Mill Springs, General Felix Zollicoffer moved most of his army, 6,000 men, across the Cumberland River to Beech Grove. Soldiers built earthworks and constructed quarters for what they believed would be a long stay. After the Battle of Mill Springs of January 19, 1862, the Confederates retreated to Beech Grove and then crossed the river to Mill Springs. A New York Herald reporter who visited the deserted encampment dubbed it Zolli's Den. A line of earthworks with 3 earthen forts protected the camp. 2 more forts stood behind it. One protected a road to the ferry landing, the other the Confederate flank. Soldiers working day and night finished building the impressive earthworks before the end of December. Zollicoffer wrote of the position, "The river protects our rear and flanks, but a number of soldiers expressed concern. If the enemy should whip us," wrote one, "they will get most of our baggage, as it will be impossible for us to get it back across the river and save ourselves." He was correct. Soon after retreating, Confederates reached Beech Grove. Confederate Commander General George B. Crittenden ordered them across the rain-swollen Cumberland River. The retreat did not end until the army reached Tennessee. When Union soldiers entered the deserted encampment the next day, they found 1,000 horses and mules running loose, and 10 pieces of artillery with ammunition in the caissons and horses in the traces. The fleeing Confederates left a battery wagon, forge, quantities of small arms and ammunition, and untold numbers of personal items. Here is a state historic marker about Beech Grove. In late 1861, Confederate General Felix Zollicoffer advanced into Kentucky from Jamestown, Tennessee. Zollicoffer ordered seizure of area ferry boats to cross his army to the north side of the Cumberland River. Unable to locate adequate boats, Zollicoffer constructed transports at Mill Springs. On December 5, 1861, he crossed his army and built a winter camp here at Beech Grove. At Beech Grove, Zollicoffer's army was supplied by a steamboat, the Noble Ellis. When the Confederates were defeated at the Battle of Mill Springs on January 19, 1862, they returned to their camp here. To escape advancing Union troops, that night several boats, including the Noble Ellis, took the Confederates to the south side of the river. The Noble Ellis was then burned. And just for what it's worth, there is a little walking trail here. It actually goes on for quite a while, and I went through, and this is something I'd like to explore more on another day. This would be a great hike. If you had, maybe even an hour or two just to go roam around back here for the heck of it, I would really like to do that. But this was just nice, and I wanted to just stick my head back here and check it out. Yeah, here's basically what I saw. Just kind of panning around. And again, you could do this as a driving tour and not get out of your car at all, which we pretty much did. That's basically what we were doing on this particular day. But there's a lot of areas to get out and look around and see what's there for what it's worth. So yeah, we are leaving this stop which again is stop number 7, Confederate fortified camp at Beech Grove. And we're going to drive towards the last stop on the basic tour. And as you can see, this has taken us roughly, very roughly, not counting our picnic that we stopped for and I didn't include on the video, but it's about an hour drive. I mean, you can do this little tour, hour and a half. You can do this pretty easily from the visitor center to stop number 8. And I wanted to mention before we get to stop number 8, we're about to hit, and this is not on the map or noted anywhere, it's Zollicoffer's headquarters. And there's just a little sign there, and you can see a chimney. There's still a chimney standing there. Apparently that was one of the headquarters used in the battle, or used in this campaign here. And there's just a very brief marker, and we're back on the road to stop number 8, the ferry landing, from the Mill Springs Battlefield Driving Tour Guide. On the night of January 19th, the early morning of the 20th, the Confederates abandoned their camps and passed down this road to the ferry boat which would carry them across the river to Mill Springs. The original road, now covered by Lake Cumberland, curved sharply to the left from this point and followed the bluff about 500 yards to the ferry landing. And then it notes that this concludes the battle tour north of the Cumberland River. Other sites important to Mill Springs campaign are at Tour Stop 9 and Tour Stop 10 across the lake at Mill Springs. And then it kind of gives directions on how to get there for what that's worth. So yeah, so you get to the little ferry landing area here in a moment. And once we get to the ferry landing here shortly, there is one park sign that talks about the crossing. And it says the Confederate Army arrived in Mill Springs in November 1861. For some time, Confederate General Felix K. Zollicoffer's pleas for more men and supplies were ignored. Finally, his superior sent the steamboat Noble Ellis up from Nashville with provisions and clothing. The small stern wheeler docked at Mill Springs on the south side of the Cumberland River. After the hard-fought Battle of Mill Springs on January 19, 1862, the defeated Confederates fled back to the Beech Grove encampment across the river from Mill Springs. The Confederates knew that escape depended on getting across the swollen Cumberland River. As darkness fell, Union forces stopped their pursuit. General George H. Thomas planned to make a final assault on the Confederates in this morning. Union artillery shelled the river crossing as the Noble Ellis and a few rowboats worked through the night ferrying the Confederate Army to Mill Springs. Thousands crowded at the riverbank. W.J. Warsham, 29th Tennessee Infantry, described the chaos. We were on the riverbank in a compact mass of excited and confused humanity. Thousands were crowded there waiting, each his turn to get on the Noble Ellis as she crossed and recrossed the river. The enemy just a little over a mile behind, who, from their battery above us on a hill, kept constantly shelling the boat as she crossed back and forth with her excited fugitive load. So yeah, that is the last sign as we drive around at the ferry landing. And I filmed just a little bit just to give you an idea of what's going on. Lots of boats out there today. But yeah, that's the end of the driving tour. And just for what it's worth, I was thinking about it as we were going through. I said the tour kind of goes in reverse order, but it doesn't. It kind of goes in, the battle kind of flowed forwards towards the visitor center, then kind of backwards towards the direction of the tour. Well, I'll take you real quickly through the museum. This is the museum, the visitor center at the Mill Springs Battlefield, the visitor center. So you walk in and there's all sorts of displays. It's generally, it is a small kind of museum. There's General Thomas, led the Union in this area. The notes there mention that he was a fairly large fella, and I think they said he weighed around 300 pounds. And it also talks about how there was a Confederate local government set up for Kentucky. I mean, it really didn't do anything, but they were there. and there's some rifles, and here's some artillery shells used in the battle. I love that kind of stuff. I think that's really interesting. You know, they were there and inflicted damage, I'm sure. And again, it's $5 to go through this museum. It's definitely worth it. If you're going to go and tour the battlefield anyway, you should stop by and pay your $5 to walk through the museum. They have a gift shop also. I remember the gift shop being a little more well stocked than it is at the moment. Oh yeah, okay. It's talking about some objects found at the Confederate camp, and then there's some on the other side from the Union camp. But yeah, they do have some books in the gift shop. They still have, you can buy little pieces of the Zoli tree that was, again, hit by lightning back in 95, and it came down, but you can buy little tiny pieces of it, I think for $1. I picked up a couple of those. I love that sort of thing. And they've made some pins and other items, I think some keychains out of parts of the tree. There's a belt buckle with the initials PP on it. There's a little story beside it. If you go to the museum, check that out, about how they were able to basically track down who PP was. It's another case with some personal items. Some tintype photos, guns. Oh, okay, and these came from a specific person. And I went through the museum once, slowly, and I took some pictures and kind of enjoyed what was going on. Oh, and there's a flag that would have been in the area at the time of the battle, and that's kind of neat that it was donated to the museum. They mentioned it probably would have hung from a pro-Union home or something along those lines. And some belt buckles. Those are always cool. It's great that they're still preserved. Some bags and scabbards, and here's some flags. Some flags that you'll recognize, some Union and some Confederate ones. All well known. You got the Orphan Brigade flag over there on the right. One of the more interesting Kentucky groups. If you're reading up on the Civil War and Kentucky here in the state. Yeah, and before I forget, there was one more thing I wanted to mention. Again, from the driving tour guide that they give you free here at the museum before you start your driving tour, just to give you a sense of what happened at the battle in the aftermath section. The Federals suffered 246 casualties in the battle. Of these, 55 were killed or mortally wounded. The Confederates suffered 533 casualties, including 150 killed or mortally wounded. These were left on the field to be buried in a mass grave near the site of Zollicoffer's death. This Federal victory broke the Confederate defense line across Kentucky and placed pro-Union eastern Kentucky into Federal hands, and also opened pro-Union eastern Tennessee for Federal invasion. The Confederate defeat, coupled with the subsequent loss of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, ultimately led to the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862. It just kind of gives you a rough idea of what happened there as far as the casualties go and what the battle meant exactly. Oh, and here in the museum, I like these dioramas here, but again, some of the clothes, even on the mannequins, the outfits, the uniforms look just a little too new, but they do a good job. I've mentioned that I paint soldiers, and I love getting pictures of these guys in these uniforms, just as painting references. And I'm glad they had these nice life-size dioramas, just making the place that much more interesting. And you've got some outfits here. And here's a little more going on throughout the museum, more stuff from the battle. little information about it. And there's a Bible. The Bible's obviously connected to the battle. There's a little more information about it and the signature of who it belonged to. Yeah, there's an inscription there. Oh wow, yeah. Just interesting. And it's always incredible to me to be standing next to something like that and just looking at it and knowing its significance. Oh yeah, and there's a handwritten letter from the battle. In just a period room. Yeah, and another reason to appreciate a museum and a battlefield and just a something so nice like this in Kentucky. We're the only people at the museum on this day. It's a Saturday morning, and we're it. No one else was here. We had the place to ourselves. And hopefully more people will get how cool of a place this is and go out to check it out. But we literally had this museum to ourselves the day we were there. And again, with everything going on right now in the world, that's not a bad thing at all. But this particular museum deserves more. It's just one of those things that blows me away that something like this just isn't more crowded and more hopping. It's something really special. So, and yeah, again, they appreciate you coming by, and I'm sure they have a lot of volunteers helping out, because our $5 each on this morning, really didn't even cover the costs of our being there. So yeah, and you get to see great relics like this from the battlefield. This is just really impressive to me. Something I thought that was kind of neat, just something small, is that little window. Yeah, there it is. There's a little window looking out over the cemetery. The cemetery that we saw earlier in the video, the National Cemetery, is right beside the visitor center, so you can check that out right there. Just a nice little, don't forget where you are. Don't forget what happened, and people sacrificed their lives and all that. I was going to say too, we're about to check out the stump of the Zollicoffer tree. Yeah, that's the actual stump right there, and they've done a little diorama, a life-size here it is kind of thing, and that's pretty impressive. I'm glad they've actually got what was left of the original tree there. And there's a little display about the young lady that decorated the tree and started that tradition, which is pretty cool too. That's definitely a nice tradition that they keep going. I probably have to check that out. I'll have to go out there on the day when that happens. Something to think about doing, maybe. Oh, and yeah, and here's a great kind of life-size diorama of a surgeon and a patient on the battlefield. Look at that. And again, I mentioned it before, the surgeons were pretty much amputating. They weren't, the doctors weren't, patting people on the back and giving them some pills to get on with it. And there's some medicine bottles. I think that's really cool. Some nice relics from that time and that period. And I mentioned, looking at that surgeon again, I paint figures, and it was hard to find a nice surgeon figure to paint. And Conte Collectibles makes a nice Civil War type surgeon. It comes in one of their Battle of the Alamo sets, if you're a figure painter. And then right here is kind of the last little room you go through at the museum, and this is somewhat of a, despite, there's a lot of Holy Grail pieces in the other couple of rooms, but this is a pretty exciting room with lots of weapons and other items related to the Civil War. I love seeing, the cartridge boxes and that kind of thing still in the package like that. That's just really fascinating to me. They've got some great Civil War painting signed editions up. Some Don Trani there, signed and remarked. That's a pretty cool piece if you're into art at all. Obviously, boots, more art. I was trying to read that sign a little bit. I couldn't quite tell what was going on with that piece of art back there. I was curious about it though. And covers, they've got some great envelopes from that time period too. And exit to the gift shop. The gift shop's right out those doors. And yeah, Confederate currency. I love this kind of stuff. I've got a few bills myself that I've picked up when I can find a good deal on them. It's hard to find affordable, nice Confederate currency anymore. That stuff is really collectible. But just kind of interesting too, just for what it is. And I love looking at the bullets from from the war and from the battlefield too. Anytime I go to a museum, I think that's just really cool. And you can actually find these kind of affordable if you look around. A lot of battlefield gift shops near battlefields, not on national parks, of course, but you can usually find those used bullets for $3 to $5, $6 each. Some of the more affordable Civil War collectibles that someone can actually buy. Yeah, anyway, that's about it. Thanks for hanging in there with me. I hope you enjoyed this. Hopefully you can use the driving tour part of the video as a reference when you go tour the battlefield.